Last week, I gave a talk at Grinnell University. It was bitterly cold, but I was really glad to be there. My talk was about the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution and the relationship to the civil rights laws of the 1960s. And I'm not going to recapitulate that entire talk because it was 40 minutes long and very much geared towards being in a room with lots of people and everything. But there was a riff in the middle of that talk, not a scheduled riff, something that I thought about while I was speaking, and I decided to share it with the audience that I want to share with you because it's a little more contained and appropriate. And that riff was about the abolitionists, about the abolition movement, about the movement to abolish slavery, and particularly the, you might call it, second wave of that movement beginning in the 1820s with the founding and publication of William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator, continuing on into the Civil War and ending with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. I've read a lot about the history of slavery, American slavery specifically, about the abolition movement. A book I will recommend right here and now is called The Slave's Cause by Manisha Sinha, a wonderful historian. And this is a wonderful book that is sort of maybe the best single volume tome on the history of American abolitionism. But it's a broad subject, an important subject. You want to read books by Eric Foner and Ira Berlin, among others. It's a wonderful book by an historian, Kate Mazur, about the efforts of free Black Americans before the Civil War to fight for their rights, called Until Justice Be Done. A lot of books. And as always, I will try to leave the actual books I recommend in the description of this video. But I've read a lot about this subject. I've thought a lot about this subject. And the thing that I find remarkable about this subject is just the basic perspective of the people involved in it. And what I mean by that is that if you're Garrison in the 1820s, if you're Douglas in the 1830s, if you are Salmon Chase, that's salmon like the fish, an Ohio lawyer turned politician, anti-slavery politician, who really gets going in Ohio politics in the 1840s and ends up becoming a very important national figure as the 1850s and 1860s progress. If you are any of these people embarking on a political project to restrict slavery, to eventually end slavery, then you are operating from the worst odds imaginable. If it's 1840, for example, then slavery has been the law of the land since the Constitution was ratified in 1788. Slaveholders hold most of the seats in the Supreme Court. Slaveholders have been most of the presidents of the United States. Slaveholders make up something like a majority of the U.S. Congress, certainly a large part of the Congress, of the House and the Senate. Slaveholders occupy important positions in the executive branch. And slavery hasn't weakened in the years since ratification. It's only gotten stronger because of economic transformations, because of technological transformations. There is a robust internal trade in enslaved people. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people crossing throughout the South, being traded, sold, bartered. There emerges a complex financial market around slavery. And the slave South is producing untold amounts of cotton and other goods for sale in the domestic and especially the world markets, since the factories of Manchester and Birmingham out in the UK need that cotton. And from the perspective of 1840 looking forward, this only looks like it's going to get worse. It doesn't look like it's going to improve in the least. Yes, there'll be small victories here and there for individual people, for individual communities, but the larger institutional picture, the larger structural picture, very much looks as if nothing is going to come to an end. And so if you are engaged in the anti-slavery struggle in the 1830s or 1840s or 1850s, you are engaged in this struggle with the knowledge that you hope to see it come to fruition, but most likely you'll die and it won't, that you'll just be carrying a baton forward in hopes that somewhere in the future they'll actually do it. You don't know how the story ends, right? And that's key. You don't know how the story ends. So you're just going to do your part. Of course, we know how the story goes, right? The political pressures around slavery become irrepressible, and what could be contained explodes onto the political scene. The 1850s become a decade of tumult as slaveholders try to press their advantage as much as possible to prevent a rising and more militant anti-slavery movement from gaining power. That anti-slavery movement coalesces in a political party, the Republican Party, and that Republican Party wins election in 1860. The slave power decides it's now or never and secedes, and we get the Civil War. And although it is the war that provides the opportunity for emancipation, it should not be ignored the extent to which it's the work of abolitionists over the previous decades and the work of anti-slavery politicians over the previous decades that created the rhetorical and intellectual framework for turning a war for union into a war for emancipation. And it is the actions of enslaved people themselves who take advantage of the war, who force political leaders to make a decision and commit to a war for emancipation. But the thing that really interests me most, and the thing I spoke about when I was in Iowa, is that notion of doing the work even when you don't know how the story is going to end, of taking your victories, small and large, and trying as much as possible to build upon them. That's part of what happened with the abolition movement. The abolitionists worked hard, and they worked hard to try to realize their vision of the world. And although if you have a cynical cast of mind, you might say that much of this was useless, to the slaveholders, this was terrifying work. There's a reason the slaveholders on the floor of Congress instituted a gag rule to keep anti-slavery petitions from reaching the floor. There's a reason why slave states banned the distribution of abolitionist materials. There's a reason why the Compromise of 1850 even existed, to try to marginalize the rising anti-slavery voices in Congress. When you look at the actions of slaveholders, what is clear is that the work and agitation of abolitionists and anti-slavery Americans was working. It was effective. It was doing something. Their fear, their panic, ends up being a signal of the success of the anti-slavery movement. Obviously, I'm thinking about the present moment. I'm thinking about what can look like insurmountable odds, the fact that this reactionary force is in control of the federal government and has the full weight of the federal government on its side. And I think the point I want to make is that even if it is an uphill battle, it's still worth doing. Even if it is an uphill battle, that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Certainly, they think it matters. The administration thinks it matters. Its attempts to repress its political opponents, its attempts to bring the force of the state against its political opponents is a sign, in the same way that gag orders were a sign then, that the reactionaries feel that the opposition to them is working, is effective. And that leads me to this other point, which is just that human agency matters. The choices we make matter. They actually do weigh on the world. And I notice in the comments that people often describe these videos, my work, as like hope core or something, but it isn't that. Like, I'm not an optimist if optimism means a Pollyannish outlook on life where everything will just work out in the end. That's not how I feel about anything. What I am is a very careful reader of American history. And I'm someone who takes human agency and contingency, meaning the unforeseen things of the world, very seriously. Human agency means that the actions of, say, Trump matter, but so do the actions of his opponents, that they're in a relationship with each other, and that no one can move without friction, and that one's options are shaped and constrained by the overall structural, institutional, and political environment in which you exist, and that even if those obstacles, even if those structures don't prevent something, they do shape the nature of the thing that happens. The other part of taking human agency seriously is recognizing that the people on the other side are human beings, that they are not special monsters or anything, that they're just ordinary people, the worst kind of ordinary people, but ordinary people nonetheless, who have all the blind spots and problems and deficiencies as ordinary people do. And contingency is just another way of saying that the choices matter, that we're not all just pushed along by the winds of structural forces, that the particular things that we do have real impact. And this is running much longer than I thought it would, so I'm going to end it now with a quote from one of my favorite pieces of journalism. I'm not sure people ever describe it as journalism, but it is a work of journalism, of journalistic analysis. It is the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx. And it's from the first section, first page. Man makes his own history, but he does not make it out of whole cloth. He does not make it out of conditions chosen by himself, but out of such as he finds close at hand. And the next line everyone knows, it's very famous, but that particular line, the preceding lines are the ones I like the most. We do make our own history. Our choices matter. They're shaped by everything around us. We can't change that. But we do make our own history. Our choices matter. And if there's anything I want you to take away from this page, these videos, it is that.